Okay, you've done a great job at laying out the layers. Now what we need to do is get them to move in a parallax fashion. Because at the moment, as the character moves and the camera moves, the background layers will follow the camera, but they won't actually move in correlation to each other. And you're probably wondering by now how we're actually going to achieve this. Well, because we've done each of these layers as shaders, we get these options down here. And notice in the x-axis we can actually offset the shader. So if I change this, it will change the offset. Now this also doesn't quite look right. We want the background to continuously repeat. If you come back to the original images under your artwork, desert theme, backgrounds, select all three of those images again. Now if you have a look at wrap mode, at the moment it's at clamp. So that just means whatever pixels are on the side when it tries to wrap, that's what pixels it'll continue to use. We don't want that, we want it to be on repeat. And just go apply. Now when we go back to our layer and start changing the offset and the x-axis, notice how it actually just offsets the background. And by adjusting this, we can actually change the current position of the background. Okay, so let's set that back to 0. And for the next part of this, we need to write some code. Since these layers are children of the follow camera, the camera is probably the best place to put the script. It will then act as the controller for each of these layers. We could make an entirely new script, but instead I'm going to add on to our camera follow 2D script. So we come to scripts, double click to open it. And this is the script we wrote before for our camera follow 2D. First up in our instance variables, let's add two vector 2s, one with movement from base and another for the base location. So what we're trying to work out here is what was the starting point for the camera in both the x and the y axis, and how far has it moved from that starting point. And we're going to use this movement from the starting point to calculate our offset for the texture. We also need to know what it is we're controlling. So I'm adding an array of floats for the layer speeds. So what speed will each layer travel at? And also an array of game object. So this is where we're actually going to store those 3 layers, or as many layers as you want. Okay, so in our start, there's not too much we need to start with. But I will just set the base location, so this public variable up here, to be equal to a new vector 2 of the transform for the current camera. So its x position and its y position. So this will act as our base position for all the calculations we're going to do from here. Okay, now onto our update loop, which, as you remember, is a function that runs on every single frame. We first need to calculate the movement from that base position. So we're going to do this with a new vector 2 that takes the current transform position and takes that from the base location. So that'll give you the difference. And we're doing this for both the x and the y axis. Now what we want to do is change the offset for each of the textures based on this offset and also on the layer speed. But first we just need to check if there's actually any layers that we can move. So if layers.length greater than 0, curly braces, we're making an integer with the name I, and we're making it equal to 0. This is just something that'll be handy as a counter for how many layers you have currently passed through. Now we're adding a for each loop. If you're familiar with for loops before, then a for each loop, instead of iterating through a set number of times, it'll just iterate through the exact number of objects that are in an array. And for each object, it is assigning it a name. So each object is of type GameObject, and it's assigned the name layer, and that is within our layers array. So this array up here. Make sure when you're using a for each loop that the data type is the same as the data type for the array. Okay, so we have the game object. Now we want to access its material. So we'll create a variable called material. This can be equal to layer, so it's the layer here. Get component from the renderer and return its material. Okay, so that's our link to the current material that we're looking at as we go through the loop. Now material, set texture offset, and we have to pass in this name here, so within double quotations underscore main text. Then we're passing in the vector 2, so this is the offset that we want to apply. In this case we're only moving it in the x-axis. On some games it may make sense to do it in the y-axis as well, but not in this case. So it's going to be based on a new vector 2, movement from base x times 1.5%. So I just got to this value because it was way too fast to start with, so I just had to bring it down to something a little more manageable. Then we're going to times it by the layer speed, and notice that we're using I here to count our times through the loop. So the position in the array of the layer speed will correspond to the position in the array of the layer. And then for the y we're just returning 0. Now of course we need to iterate I, otherwise it won't work. So we can say I++, semicolon. Okay, so based on our movement from the base, we're iterating through each layer and changing the offset in the x-axis for its material. So now when we come back to our camera, it's changed a little bit. We didn't need to make these here public properties, but while we're debugging and learning, it's good to be able to see exactly what values get put in here. So our layer speeds and layers, we have 3 layers. So let's put 3 and 3. Our furthest layer we don't want to move too far, so we'll put it at 0.2. Next one we want it to be a reasonable bit faster, so let's put it at 0.6. And again with the frontmost layer, let's go with 0.8. Now what we can do is just grab our layer and drag it onto its element. So do that for all 3 layers. Okay, and that's it. Let's now apply the prefab and run our scene. Now notice as I move across the scene that the background is now moving and each layer is moving at a different speed to the other layers. Okay, so it's working exactly how we want it to. Now if we come back over to the scene view while it's still playing and just zoom out a bit, we can get a bit more insight into how this is working. You can see here that the background is moving with the camera and that there's no overlap on the edges, so it's purely the offset that moves, not the texture itself. Now you'll remember as well I said earlier that working with a mixture of 2D and 3D objects can have some effects. Well, let's have a look over here. You see these bushes? They've clearly loaded in the scene. But when I move back over here, they've completely disappeared. So there will be conflicts between the Z order and also the draw order. In the next video, we'll just have a quick look at how we can fix that.